Ladies and gentlemen, last time we talked about the 20s, not the roaring 20s in the United States, but the 20s in the Soviet Union, a period that some people have called the golden age of communism, or a period in which a kind of communism with an alternative face emerged. However, it seems to me that the discussion of the 20s substantively should lead one to the conclusion that neither one of these hypotheses can be accepted at face value. The relative freedom of the 20s was something that was historically contingent on the continuation of the new economic policy, on the brief period of respite or breathing space that Lenin thought was an inarguable necessity to grant to the Soviet people. So the 20s historically turned out to be a moment in which the party gathered its strength. It prepared a new assault on the future, a new campaign to impose socialism, and this is the campaign over which Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin presided from 1929 on into the 1930s. Stalin thought of this assault on the bastion of the future in the name of Bolshevism and socialism. He thought of it as something equivalent to the October Revolution. In fact, he advertised it as a second October Revolution. If in October 1917 history had leapt forward through the Bolshevik seizure of power in Petrograd, now, Stalin said, there would be another leap, and perhaps one even greater, because now the party, which had consolidated its forces, had gathered its strength, was on the verge of putting socialism into practice for the first time. And of course, not incidentally, Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin himself would be the man that would preside over this process. Now, to understand what Stalin contemplated, to understand the stakes which were there in the political struggle in the late 20s, I want to step back for a moment and look at the very last stage of the succession crisis that I was dealing with at the end of last lecture. I pointed out that in the 20s, Stalin had aligned himself with various politicians. And at the end of the 20s, he was involved in a fierce debate and struggle for power with a man called Nikolai Bukharin. Bukharin was the man that Lenin thought was a respectable theorist, the bright light of the party in terms of theory, to be sure, but didn't really trust him with the plenitude of power. Well, Bukharin has an interesting history all of his own. He was a critic of Lenin's policy in Brest-Litovsk. Bukharin preferred ideological struggle against the Germans. He preferred fraternization with the enemy. He preferred no peace to the dishonorable peace of Brest-Litovsk. I mean, and dishonorable here is not to be understood in the patriotic sense, but in the ideological sense. Bukharin had emerged as a theorist in the party in the war communist period. He had written a very good primer that justified the party's attempt to impose socialism, with all of the things that that meant, during the Civil War. However, by the 20s, Bukharin, who was a little bit of a plastic personality, there was a kind of softness in his character perhaps, or perhaps he was just the true intellectual who could shrug off one theory and adopt another one and feel that he was really consistent all along. It's just that the world had changed around him. Bukharin began to sponsor the new economic policy, to become, in fact, by the end of the 20s, its spokesman, and to press it on party officials as something that might be thought of as a more permanent kind of policy. Bukharin wrote in some of his articles even that peasants should enrich themselves. His idea was that since Russia was predominantly an agricultural country, and the republics that were in the Union were agricultural mostly, that the national wealth depended upon the prosperity of agriculture and the peasantry. And therefore, what the state ought to do is encourage this agrarian sector to enrich itself, and then to take a portion of the proceeds, of the wealth that the peasants had created, and invest it in industry. And yes, this would mean that there was a kind of redistribution of wealth that was going on, but in principle it was not far different from what Nicholas II had attempted, Alexander III had attempted. In other words, Russian industry had always been built to a certain extent on redistribution of wealth from the agrarian sector to the urban sector. So this was a gradualist policy for the building of socialism. The historian and professor of government Stephen Cohen has said that if the Bolshevik Party had listened to Bukharin, that is to say, if they had adopted this program, then much of the bloodshed of the Stalinist period would have been avoided. It's one of these what-if things. Of course, we can never know. A rather more conservative historian, a man called Robert Conquest, who has written still, I suppose, the best history of collectivization and the best history of the terror in the mid-30s. Conquest has argued that Cohen is mistaken, that Bukharin wasn't really advertising this program as a permanent program. Cohen's argument is exaggerated, that the differences between Stalin and Bukharin are not as wide as Cohen imagines. Cohen has taken certain statements, sort of absolutized them, and he's created a kind of principled political difference where there was none in practice. There was simply a tactical difference at most. Well, I don't want to arbitrate this dispute. I simply want to put it out on the table. There was some kind of political disagreement, certainly about the timing of the abandonment of the new economic policy. Bukharin did not want to abandon this policy immediately in the late 20s. And perhaps there was also a principled disagreement. We may never know for sure. Stalin, for his part, had been through most of the 20s a consistent proponent of the new economic policy. Actually, one of the issues between Stalin and Trotsky was Trotsky's desire quickly to make a transition to full socialism. And Stalin thought that the time in the mid-20s was not ripe for that. There was an element of disagreement over the new economic policy in the debate between Zinoviev and Kamenev and Stalin. So Stalin had been, like Bukharin, someone that was an ally of the new economic policy. And suddenly, 1927, 1928, Stalin changed his mind. He began to argue for a more rapid construction of socialism in Russia. And this more rapid construction of socialism could not in principle be done by a gradualist program of taking small increments of wealth from the countryside and investing it in state industry. Stalin was concerned that Russia, for international reasons, the Soviet Union, for international reasons, must invest more rapidly. He began to say things like Russia must accomplish in 10 years what it's taken centuries for the West, read here the capitalist West, to accomplish. He began to say that Russia is a backward nation. The Soviet Union, even though it's nominally a socialist society, has inherited the backwardness of Russia, and it is the duty of the party to overcome this backwardness in a kind of great leap forward. The fact of the great leap, if not the rhetoric, I think, is there in Stalinism from the beginning. And Mao Zedong, who later took the term, appropriated the term, great leap forward, was really applying to Chinese conditions simply Stalinist logic. So in 1927 and 28, behind closed doors in the party, there was a debate between Bukharin and Stalin. And this debate, by 1928, was fairly clearly resolved in Stalin's favor. The party was committed, behind closed doors anyway, to the abandonment of the new economic policy. Now, how did this new policy, that didn't yet have a name, how would this new policy be advertised and implemented? Stalin was an extremely shrewd politician. He was a master of buzzwords. He was someone that maximized the political gain from his very infrequent public appearances. He never overexposed himself, unlike, well, certain politicians that we might name. Their names might spring immediately to our lips, or their images to our mind. Stalin was very careful and calibrated in his use of the media and in his appearances of the public. He seized on the term the first 5-year plan as a kind of slogan for what would be done. Now, in a sense, this was a kind of a lie, because the party had put into place already a planning agency. It was created early on in the revolution. It was small. It was carrying out a set of haphazard tasks at first, but it was trying to, in a small way at least, to set targets for the economy. So that element of party planning had already existed. But Stalin now thought that for the transition to socialism, what was needed was a longer range plan and a more comprehensive, full plan. And so through the state planning agency and through various party committees, the party worked out targets that were to go into effect in early 1929. And these targets would be announced to the country at a party congress, and they would be met then by workers and by peasants in the course of the next 5 years. The plan that was announced early in 1929 is astonishing. I mean, even as I prepare to recount it, I'm just stunned by the things that were set as targets. There were global targets, you might say, for the whole economy. That is, production in a certain sector would increase by X amount. Industrial output of heavy industries was supposed to increase in 5 years 250%. 250%. Now, even if we say, all right, Soviet industry was at that point still in a rudimentary state of development. It was, in objective terms, small. So one could make a large investment and see a significant increase. Still, 250% increase in 5 years. This is staggering to contemplate. Stalin, ever the master, of course, had a trick up his sleeve. In another year, he would say, we should achieve the 5-year goal in 4 years. So the new slogan was 5 in 4. So 250% then was supposed to be achieved in 4 years instead of 5, simply by what the czars would have called an ukaz, a decree. Party signs the pen and the thing is supposed to get itself done. There were in the 5-year plan specific enterprise targets. So for example, if you take pig iron production, it was supposed to be tripled in 5 years and then in 4. Or if you take electrical power generation, this was a symbol of modernity. Lenin once said that communism is Soviet power plus the electrification of the countryside, right? Well, electrical power production was supposed to increase by 4 times in the course of the 5-year plan. Now, meeting all of the targets that the party had set out meant building new factories, assigning workers to those factories, both to the building and construction of them and to the staffing them once they were built. It meant building rail lines to those factories and roads so that the finished goods of the factories could be taken from one point to another. In other words, it's not just that existing plants are going to be producing more. The whole economy is going to have to take a quantum leap forward in order for this socialist 5-year plan to be productive. Now, the government understood that you can set a target, but you also have to marshal resources. This was a war, really. I mean, just as General Marshall, for example, presided over the Marshall Plan and helped rebuild the European economy as part of the national defense, as well as for humanitarian reasons after the Second World War. Well, this campaign of the 5-year plan was a war. It's a war against Russian backwardness. It was a war for Soviet power survival on the international scale. So you had to marshal resources in such a way that they were targeted toward specific tasks. So what the plan specified is that about half of the state budget would be devoted to 60 gargantuan projects. Now, some of them we can understand very easily. For example, on the Dnieper River, government wanted to build a dam and to build a system of turbines that would generate electricity. And this would be part of the quadrupling of the electrical power production. Or, for example, in the area of the Far East and the South, a railroad was supposed to be built that would add additional capacity to that of the Trans-Siberian Railroad. There would be branches that would be built off this road and an additional line. So this made eminent sense, and it built upon the successes of Tsarist engineers previously. Or, for example, at a town called Magnitogorsk, which means something like magnetic mountain, at Magnitogorsk, ex nihilo, out of nothing, there was to be created a modern metallurgical industry. And at Magnitogorsk, it's a fascinating phenomenon. Workers lived in tents for the building of factories, because what came first? Do you put housing up first? Absolutely not. What's in the interest of the proletariat is the construction of the factory. That is what makes socialism possible. So workers were forced to accept privation. In some cases, we know they voluntarily accepted privation because they were empowered here. They were a part of the collective that was building socialism. Stalinism wasn't simply a matter of plans and decrees that were issued from the top down. There was also a reciprocal belief in the rightness of the party. It wasn't universally shared. There was lots of opposition to Stalin. There was much resentment, and we'll talk about that. But there was also a good deal of popular support at this stage, belief in the nostrums of socialism. And so people willingly made sacrifices that might cause you or I to blanch and to retreat. Very good young historian from Princeton, a man called Stephen Kotkin, has just published a big book called Magnetic Mountain, and the subtitle of it is Stalinism as a Civilization. Stalinism was a culture, it was a whole way of life. And at Magnitogorsk, it was, Kotkin says, in the process of creation. You can see it on the streets, you can see it in the way that people behaved, the cultural amenities that at some point came to exist, the privations that were endured, and so on. So this civilizational aspect of the first 5-year plan should not be underestimated. Now, you say to yourself, well, okay, now we understand. This was simply state engineering. The state was in the process of putting money in the kind of project that any industrializing country might put money in. But let me give you another example of a project that the state funded. And this is the so-called Belomor Canal project, the White Sea Canal. It was supposed to be a canal longer than the Panama Canal that would connect the White Sea with the Baltic. And the idea was that if you dug the canal properly and you set up a system of locks, which you had to do because the water levels were different, that you could create in the north a commerce between seas that for most of the year couldn't accommodate commercial traffic. And it would have the advantage that since it was largely inland, there would be points along the canal that you could send goods to for shipping in one direction or another. Now this White Sea Canal project, another one of these gargantuan projects, was built under the following conditions. It was built by forced labor. On the order of, the numbers can be wrong, but this is an estimate, on the order of 200,000 people worked by hand without, for the most part, heavy machinery to help them, to dig the White Sea Canal. This means, to translate it into human terms, that men and women died in the frozen north, breaking rocks with axes and picks, carrying those rocks, and so on. It was a horrendous project. The cranes that were constructed by prisoners themselves out of timber that they felled. They were not prefabricated cranes that one puts together in a few moments. It was a contest between the human will to survive, driven by the coercive power of the party into an inhumane place, a battle between that and nature. And in such battles, usually nature wins. The terrible irony, the tragedy of the White Sea Canal goes far beyond the number of people that lost their lives. 15% of the people that died out there were women. Goes far beyond that because the canal was never commercially viable. It wasn't dug deep enough for ships of any size to go back and forth. And so by the 60s, it was virtually untraveled. If you want to read a detailed description of what it was like to build this canal and of the Soviet writers who shamefully visited the project and commended it as somehow humane and in the interests of socialism, Maxim Gorky was one of them. If you want to read about that, look at Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago. He's got a chapter that tells it in detail. So the 5-year plan not only meant rational projects, it meant irrational projects, pharaonic projects, projects dependent on slave labor that are not unlike what you find in the ancient Oriental despotic states such as Egypt. Now, as we contemplate the 5-year plan and what it meant in industry, let us think about a combination of things that I've already mentioned. There was belief. Party people believed in socialism and believed in the plan, and many of the workers believed in it as well. There was also an element of realpolitik. Stalin understood that Soviet Russia was, relatively speaking, diplomatically isolated, relatively speaking, backward as a country. It would have to have a larger industrial capacity if it was going to meet the eventual military challenge of bourgeois states, which theory told him by this time must happen. So realpolitik was an element in the calculation behind the plan. And also there was coercion. Think about those workers shivering at Magnitogorsk. Think about the coerced, the forced labor in the White Sea Canal project. Belief in the greatness of socialism and coercion in the implementation of socialist goals are not incompatible. They can exist side by side. And sometimes they can exist in the same human soul. One might feel attracted to socialism and yet somehow not want to participate in a particular building project and yet be coerced to do so. So we're talking not just about the externalia of a civilization. We're talking about a mixture of motives that changes the internal psyches, the very substance of human beings. What was the significance of the 5-year plan in economic terms? Well, first of all, since it was the first 5-year plan, it implied that there would be others. It meant that there would be 5-year plans in the future, that the Soviet Union was now a planned economy, that never again would the anarchy of the market be permitted to visit the Soviet soil. Economically, in certain sectors, it caused chaos. All those building projects that were new robbed materials from existing projects. In some cases, factories were built, but there were no machines to put inside of them. Other places, machines were constructed with no factories that were ready. And this kind of chaos under the surface, the nice targets that the party set and everyone said was achieved, this kind of chaos was something that became institutionalized in the Soviet economy. And any accounting of the Soviet economy, it seems to me, has to struggle with the degree of difficulty that managers had to, on a daily or weekly basis, contend with. Statistical reports that were issued in the 5-year plan were, I'm afraid, not particularly accurate. In fact, some of them were out and out falsified. And the reason is that one could not admit failure. So one simply declared victory and went home. Obviously, in economic terms, there was a trade-off between consumption and capital investment. The state decided to take wealth and invest it in big industry, and it was at the cost of consumers. Light industry was allowed pretty much to wither or to remain vestigial, while the big bucks, the clout, the power, was involved in big industry. That's only a part of the first 5-year plan. And now we come to one of the most disastrous episodes in Soviet history and in the history of the world, and that is collectivization of agriculture. The 5-year plan declared a goal of creating enormous rural collectives which would function according to rational scientific principles. Farming would no longer be done by draft animals. It would, after a transitional period, be done by machinery. That's the way that the Soviet leadership felt that farming ought to be. In fact, we can imagine the goal of collectivization more clearly if we think that what the party was trying to accomplish was the creation of a giant factory system of agriculture. Each of the collective farms was literally like a factory. Workers, the peasants, were going to be housed together in one place. This means a lot of displacement from existing homes, incidentally. They were going to be assigned tasks by a collective chairman who would be implementing a certain part of the 5-year plan, and then they would go out and do the task. And they would have modern tools to do the task, so the state would meanwhile be building tractors and so on, and modern harvesting equipment. So they would go out into the countryside as factory workers in the cities would do, and they would do their job. Now, as a precondition for entering the collective, it's a privilege, right? What a privilege to be a collective farmer, to take part in construction of socialism, but you had to give up certain things. You had to give up private property of the sort that you couldn't wear on your back or use in your kitchen. In other words, you had to give up something that was very precious to the peasants, their draft animals. You had to sign a document when you entered a collective that said that this property, which belonged previously to my household, now belongs to the collective. And of course, tools which you used in farming also had to be surrendered to the collective. This means that the farmer is giving up the tools of his or her trade. And that is, from the point of view of peasants who are always suspicious of innovation, that is an enormous psychological step to take. To trust the party, the urban-based party. I don't know, if I am a peasant, whether I would be willing to do so. Now, collectivization, according to the party, could not be accomplished unless something else were done simultaneously. And that is the elimination of the wealthiest peasants from the village. The wealthiest peasants were called in the Russian slang of the day kulaks. Kulak, incidentally, means fist. And I don't know, maybe it's because in popular culture it was thought that kulaks were heavy-fisted types that beat down their neighbors, and this pejorative term that was assigned to the wealthier peasants was appropriated by the party. I really don't know in detail the history of the term, but it was a pejorative, a nasty thing to be called a kulak. Who were these kulaks? Well, this is a very complicated question. At one level, it's simple. Kulaks are whoever the party says are kulaks. So there's a formal definition. Anyone who hires labor for 80 days a year, and anyone who has a certain yearly income in ruble is ipso facto a kulak. About 2% of the population at one point was statistically declared to be kulak. Now, That's the simple answer. The reality in the peasant village is a little bit different. And here we have to talk about something that existed in Russia that I haven't explained up to this point for want of time to do it, and that is the peasant commune. Remember, the peasant commune consists of all of the household heads of a given village. Usually there were 50 to 100 people that would constitute the heads of household in a given village and would have voting power in the commune. Now, most of these heads of household were males, because males were thought to be the head of the family, although if the male head of household had died, a woman could represent her family as a head of household and vote in the communal assembly. The elite people in the commune tended to be people that were older, that is 40-ish, because that was quite old in the Russian village context. Life expectancy wasn't that long. They tended to be 40-ish or so. And the younger people in a given household might be 20-ish, and they might not even be represented as heads of households, or if they were, they had just split off from their father's house to form their own communal unit. Now, here we come to the definitional question. Who are kulaks? In this context, the people who are most prosperous in terms of owning the most animals and tools are people who are 40 or so. If you look at those very same people when they were 20, they might have had nothing, no tools and no draft animals. They had to work in order to obtain those things. And of course, those people's children, the supposedly wealthy peasants, I mean, they were going to leave the house eventually, if they were female, and marry into some other family, or set up, if they were male, their own household. Actually, therefore, in the context of the Russian village, the inequality that existed was simply a generational inequality. That was the inequality. Otherwise, there wasn't inequality, and how could there be? Because the commune periodically redistributed land amongst households. It was an institution set up to be fair. So the whole notion that somehow the kulaks in the countryside were social enemies of the proletariat and somehow different from other peasants, this was nonsense on stilts from the peasant point of view. Can you imagine anything on earth more cohesive than a village where everyone knows everyone? I mean, it's like a dormitory, for heaven's sakes. 100, 200 people, they all know each other. They know each other's life histories, any philandry, any miscreancy. They all know everything about everybody else. And when outsiders come and say, well, name the kulaks here, these people turn with unbelieving eyes. What? Kulaks here? This we cannot recognize. So Lenin, in wanting to dekulakify the Russian village, underestimated or simply misunderstood the equality that already existed in the Russian communes. Kulaks were also the other people in the countryside that the Bolsheviks targeted as enemies. They were, in the western periphery, rabbis who were running schools and educating children in Judaism. They were, in Ukraine and central Russia, priests. They were anybody that had had any connection with the White Army in the Civil War, or any connection with a peasant rebellion. They were, in other words, all of the people that had been politically or religiously active in previous periods. And these people had to be classified as kulaks and eliminated from the village. So what happened in collectivization is that the party arrested kulaks after having identified them, put them in transit camps, eventually shipped them to Siberia, to prison labor camps, and they were not heard from again for a long time. Now, understandably, even where peasants had been more or less forced to sign on the dotted line, there was resistance to this kind of high-handed policy. And in order to meet the resistance, the party sent the army, it sent the security organs, that is the Cheka and its successors, it sent armed detachment of workers to the countryside in order to make sure that the policy was carried out. It's interesting that Stalin, who's a great manipulator of people's loyalties, used nationality and ethnic identity as a tool. Usually, if a security detachment was sent to a Russian village, it would be headed by somebody of another ethnic background. And that is because he didn't want unpleasant tasks to be discharged by people of the same ethnicity. He didn't want that because he remembered in the revolution that there were points when Cossacks, for example, refused to fire on other people that were Russians that they identified as their Russian brothers. Stalin didn't want that kind of resistance in the security organs. Divide et impera, which is as old as Caesar, probably older than that. The greatest test of collectivization was in Ukraine. In Ukraine, there was less of a tradition of communal agriculture than in central Russia. There was therefore a more individualist character to farming. There was incomparably more resistance to collectivization in Ukraine than there was in the middle of Russia. And Stalin used this resistance as a pretext to accomplish not only collectivization by force, but also the destruction of the Ukrainian nation. In 1932-1933, the government sealed the borders of Ukraine so that train shipments of food could go out of Ukraine, but no food could come back in. Ukrainian farmers were subjected to an artificially created famine. You can read, our government has published 3 volumes of eyewitness testimony of survivors of this famine. Some of the accounts are in English, some in Russian, some in Ukrainian. There were terrible things that were observed. There was widespread malnutrition, there was starvation. Some peasant families survived when a child had died by butchering and cooking the child. There was cannibalism such that it wasn't safe for young children or even adults to wander alone in the fields because people feasted on on the food resources of their neighbor. Conquest estimates that perhaps as many as 5 million people died in Ukraine alone during the famine of 1932-33. Some demographers have said that this is a high estimate. They think maybe 2.5 million. However one counts, this was an enormous, appalling catastrophe. So in conclusion, collectivization succeeded. Socialism, as Stalin envisioned it, was happening in Russia. This was a planned society, but the plan had entailed bloodshed that neither you nor I can in our wildest dreams ever contemplate.